Welcome to the second collaborative educational meeting of the Colorado League of Women Voters News Access and Literary Task Force and the Colorado Climate Emergency Task Force. My name is Sandy Schuster. Both of these task forces have members from all over Colorado. We encourage our task force members to share what they learn here with their local communities and local league members to get the word out about two of the most critical issues of our time, communication and the environment. We also invite you to become members of one or both of these task forces to stay informed on the latest information. Please stay on mute during the presentation. Put questions in the chat, and we will save them and until the Q&A at the end, and then we'll read the ones that we can get to. Our next meeting will be on January 21st. Here to tell you about that meeting, our upcoming collaboration, and introduce today's speaker is Linda Hutchinson from the League of Women Voters of Larimer County, who chairs the News Access and Literary, I cannot say that word, Literary Task Force, and is a member of the Colorado League of Women Voters Board. Linda, take it away.
Okay, so on January 21st, Jane has to remind me what this is about. I didn't know I was supposed to speak about January 21st.
Oh, sorry.
That's okay. You're muted, Jane.
Tell her it's about strip for parts.
Well, strip for parts isn't. Okay, well, on January 20th, we're doing strip for parts.
Oh, okay. Okay. All right. I thought you said 20th.
Yeah.
I thought you said.
The 21st is about water.
Okay.
Yeah. How about if I just tell them about it at the end and you go straight to let us meet Dr. Chen?
All right.
All right.
I'm Linda Hutchinson with the News Access and Literacy Task Force, and it's my pleasure to once again introduce you to Dr. Phil Chen. Dr. Chen is an associate professor of political science at the University of Denver. He specializes in political psychology, specifically the ways that social identities shape political attitudes and behaviors. He teaches numerous classes on American politics, including misinformation and conspiracy theories in America, polarization in America, and race and ethnicity in U.S. politics. Dr. Chen is a frequent contributor to local and national media on topics ranging from election results to political violence. So welcome, Dr. Chen.
Hi, well, thanks for having me. I'm going to share my screen with the PowerPoint, so hopefully somebody can give me a thumbs up if you can see it. Okay, let me get the hiding of the media controls. There we go. Okay, so what I'm going to try to do for you all today is give you a little bit of some of you have seen me present on misinformation or conspiracy theories more generally. Today I was asked to do something a little bit more specific around climate science, climate misinformation, and then the consequences both nationally, politically, as well as here in Colorado. So for those who don't remember, the snowballs in the Senate is a specific reference. Well, maybe this is gonna work. There we go. In 2015, Senator James Inhofe, senator from Oklahoma, brought a snowball to the floor of the U.S. Senate. And basically said, in case we've forgotten, because we keep hearing that 2014 has been the warmest year on record. I asked the chair, do you know what this is? It's a snowball just from outside here, so it's very, very cold out, very unseasonable. What Senator Inhofe is doing here is perpetuating some of the bigger myths or pieces of misinformation around climate science, and conflating weather with with climate, right? Basically saying climate change, climate science is a myth. Look, it's snowy. How can the world be warming? Um, that's just one aspect of climate misinformation or climate change denial that we'll talk about. And I've got a whole bunch of different kind of examples and ways to think through this. Um, for those who've seen me present before, this might look familiar. Key terms, I like to start this off with these key terms, ignorance, right? Just not knowing something. Not everything is misinformation. If it's not factually correct, but we just don't know, then it can just be ignorance. And often ignorance is a reason that we end up spreading misinformation, not because we want to be spreading something that is inaccurate, but because we simply don't know and it sounds believable. Conspiracy theories are specifically around people working sort of in secret to achieve some goal. We don't see as much of the kind of conspiratorial thinking in the climate science denial or just sort of climate misinformation world, but we do see some aspects, and you'll see that later on, and I'll talk about that. The ones that we are mostly concerned about today are misinformation, right? Misinformation is beliefs that people think are factual, but that are actually false or contradicted by the best publicly available information. So, it doesn't mean that it's misinformation if we just simply didn't, if the best publicly available information says this, but then there's actually some information that isn't public that counteracts that. That's not necessarily misinformation because the information appears to be correct publicly. And then disinformation is the intentional spreading of misinformation. So we sometimes hear these kind of grouped together, but disinformation is basically the spreading misinformation once you already know that it's false, often with some like broader purpose. And the big question of why we believe in misinformation is, in my view, psychology. There are some sort of simple pieces to this, right? Um, the kind of assumption of truth, some credible source stuff. Sorry, let me put my phone on silent so that I can use my timer and I know how much time I have left. Credible sources, things like that. But then we've got the sort of bigger ones that come out a lot with climate science is what we call scientific window dressing. So saying, okay, well, here's a graph, but here's an alternative graph. People like graphs, tables, things like that. That leads us to believe that something is true, even if that is perhaps altered or made up or AI generated or something like that. The other thing that is really, really common in climate misinformation are stories, right? We get stories versus facts. And if people have to choose between sort of believing some like story or anecdote or believing, some long list of facts, the thing is, those stories are actually far more convincing for many people. And so the story aspect, coming in saying, well, we just got, 8 inches of snow. How can we have global warming? They must be wrong because look at all of the snow we just got. That's a story. It's an anecdote. It's not based in fact, but it is a reflection of what we know about why people believe misinformation. And then the big pieces, again, this should look familiar to some of you. Big pieces psychologically, what we call motivated reasoning. Basically, we tend to believe information when it already accords or confirms our prior beliefs. This is what we call directionally motivated reasoning. So we tend to believe information because it confirms what we already think. And we're gonna see that throughout as we start talking about climate science and climate denial. And then also emotions, right? Emotionally charged information is easier for people to remember, and much more likely for us to share that. And so, to the extent that climate change or climate misinformation is emotionally charged, maybe it's tied to our identities, our work, something like that, then that ties it into our emotions, makes it much more likely to be spread. Whereas, scientific articles tend to not pull on our emotions. And so people don't share scientific articles all that often because they're generally not emotionally charged. And it's one of the things we try to avoid when we're writing these articles. Okay, so let's look specifically at climate change. I think it's important that we start with this idea of sort of where we're coming from. Basically, who is it that believes climate misinformation? Because I think that's going to help identify kind of where the scope of the problem is here. Um, First off, just in general, the public tends to be more skeptical of climate change than scientists. This is data from 2015. This is not specific to climate scientists, but about 90% of scientists believe that global warming is happening, whereas only about 64% of the public believe it is happening. And then belief that it is anthropogenic or caused by humans, again, scientists at about 81%, public at about 57%. So this is a consistent gap that we see on in terms of climate science, that scientists are significantly more likely to say that climate change is happening and that it's caused by humans. If you look just at published climate science, the comparison is even starker, right? There was an article that looked at all of the papers published on climate change and climate science in 2013 and 2014. There were 69,406 unique authors of peer-reviewed papers on human-caused climate change. Of those 69,000-ish authors, four were people who rejected that it was human caused, right? 0.0058%. Scientists overwhelmingly agree that the climate is changing and that it is caused by human activities. So what is it that predicts the belief that it is happening, that climate change is happening? We can kind of group it into two main factors, right? Political factors. I think it shouldn't be surprising given the rhetoric of the parties that Democrats and liberals are more likely to believe that climate change is happening. And then we also get kind of these broader political beliefs, higher levels of trust in the government and trust in science will lead you to be more likely to believe that climate change is happening. We also see this interesting thing that people who perceive that the weather, their local weather, is more extreme are also likely to believe that climate change, more likely to believe that climate change is happening, which makes sense, right? Because we're using our own experiences and our own views of science and the government, as well as the signals that we receive from political parties. So that's kind of the broad strokes of belief in climate science. But there's a key complication. And this complication is going to be something that comes up a lot, sort of throughout what we're doing here, and is going to make the kind of the solution or what we do about this a little bit more difficult. This is a graph from a paper by Brendan Nyhan. On the left side, these are the people with the lowest level of what we call political knowledge. They're the least politically knowledgeable. They don't, maybe they don't know who controls the Senate. They might not know, who the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court is. Conservatives and liberals don't look any different. Those are insignificant differences. Conservatives and liberals at that lowest level of knowledge can both believe that global warming is happening. The more knowledge you gain, nothing happens to liberals, but conservatives become much, much less likely to believe that global warming is happening, the more knowledge they gain. This is the complication that makes this not just climate change, but so much of the work that we do on misinformation tricky. We can't educate our way out of the problem, right? Education can help in some areas, right? That's largely among people who already believe climate change is real. I'll talk about this more later on. There's an article I assigned, and I'll show some things from it called Doing the Wrong Things for the Right Reasons. So people who already think, okay, climate change is happening, I have to do something about it, they might do something inaccurate. They might be, trying to recycle it. They're actually like sending it to a company that ends up sending it to, to Bolivia or China or someplace like that. But education works in those cases. It's really hard to educate people out of these motivated beliefs. And so education is not this kind of simple solution as much as we might like it to be. Um, this, I think, is education and knowledge is kind of the biggest complication we have in misinformation research. Because we really want to believe that as people learn more about something, they adjust their beliefs. But the reality is different. The reality is that education gives people tools to understand arguments and then argue against them so that their prior beliefs are supported, right? So the more knowledge you have, the more you're able to say, oh, okay, but sure, there's that piece, but this other thing I read shows that that's not accurate, and that's so I'm gonna pick apart this argument and show it to myself that they're actually wrong, right? So education isn't the clear solution that we might hope it is. It doesn't mean we shouldn't encourage education about issues. It's that we shouldn't think of that as the only possibility because the evidence is not clear that education is a really strong way to combat misinformation. I want to do a real quick aside here on Republicans and conservatives because there's a whole set of debates in work on misinformation and conspiracy theories about whether there is something unique about Republicans and conservatives or whether it's just the natural sort of psychological processes. I fall into the natural psychological process camp, right? Essentially, what we've seen, right, is that science, skepticism of science is motivated reasoning now. So one party maybe is a little bit more likely to challenge science, and because of that, people of that party are motivated to also challenge science. Um, and so this rejection of science that runs counter to your beliefs is kind of a natural component of the current political process. Now, it is true. Democrats, independents, liberals, they do appear to be more deferential to science. Um, Here's a graph from, I think this is from Pew in the 2019-20. I'll blow up this little panel here. Uh, it's not just a US based thing, right? Yes, in the US, about 62% of people on the left trust scientists, whereas 20% on the right do, about a 42-point difference between them. But we see a similar difference in Canada, 39-point difference. Smaller but still significant differences in Australia, the UK, Germany, Italy. The only places where we really see it kind of go away are places like Poland, Brazil, France, interestingly enough, South Korea, Czech Republic. But in what we sort of think of as English speaking or other sort of major or regional powers, we see this kind of this pattern emerge. People on the left are more trusting of science. But, and this is the but that I always try to push with my students, that does not mean that there is something inherent about Republicans or conservatives that lead them to be more skeptical of science. There are many, many reasons why they may be rightfully or justified in that skepticism. So we can look here. This is professors from different subject areas and the percentage of their political donations that went to Republicans. It was never high. In 2004, 2008, it's around 10%. It drops off significantly below 5% for all of the different scientific areas by 2020. So professors are largely not Republicans. We see differences even within certain professions. So while doctors overall are about evenly split, about 46% are Republicans, 54%, this is of those who are registered with the party, 54% are Democrats. Your pediatricians, overwhelmingly Democratic. Surgeons, pretty much overwhelmingly Republican. So your pediatrician, your psychiatrist, your infectious disease doctor, they're likely to be a Democrat. Your surgeon and your anesthesiologist are likely to be Republicans. So we see these divides, right? So there are real divides among professors and doctors and professions. So it's true that scientists are more liberal. Um, the other reasons that Republicans and conservatives might just be more resistant to uh, public science or climate science is that public science policy usually recommends some type of government action. And so, if you are opposed to government action or you're opposed, you're sort of limited government, small government, think it should be done by private individuals, then public science policy doesn't really fit ideologically. It's not something about I want to disbelieve science. It's the science is telling me that the government has to do something, and that runs counter to my ideological beliefs. Um, and then you couple all of that with the fact that elites on the right just simply are more likely to criticize scientists and deny anthropogenic climate change. We see this very much this right now in this administration, willingness to challenge higher education and universities. And so you just see politicians on the right being more likely to criticize scientists. And so if this is all a motivated process, it makes sense. Scientists are more liberal. The policy recommendations they make say the government should act, and elites are saying, well, scientists are wrong. They're not, accounting for these things. So it's not that there's something inherent about being a Republican or a conservative. It's that it's the environment that leads to that. If these roles were switched, we would see Democrats and liberals being more likely to deny science. And I have an example later on in this of just that kind of a situation. Okay. So that's the kind of where we at, what are the sort of the contours of belief here. I was also asked to talk about sort of why climate misinformation is dangerous. And there's an obvious answer, and there's I think, a less obvious answer. The obvious answer, I think, is that climate change denial and misinformation is associated with inaction. Um, so if you deny that climate change is happening, you also are very likely to say the government shouldn't do anything about it because you don't believe it exists. Um, Scientific estimates vary, but any of the average maybe is like a 3 or 4 degrees Celsius increase in global temperatures by the end of the century, right? Which doesn't always sound like a lot, but if we look at some of the maps of the cities that are threatened by rising sea levels, 2 degree versus 4 degree warming. In New York, if we saw, a 2 degree warming in the climate, it would be about 13% of the population of New York would be affected, 23% at 4% warming. 8 to 13% in London. But then if you look at the developing or the third world, you see even larger differences. In Shanghai, 39 to 76% of the population, 24 to 51% of the population in Calcutta, 30 to 60% of the population in Hanoi. Um, you know, Coastal cities are going to be deeply affected by a warming climate and rising sea levels. So that's the obvious answer as to why climate misinformation is dangerous, right? That it leads to inaction, and inaction leads to climate disaster. The less obvious answer, I think, is that misinformation about the climate shifts blame and it changes the way that we behave, right? So it can lead to a lot of different things. It can lead to fatalism, right? If the misinformation is not climate change isn't happening, but we're too far gone, and it doesn't matter what we do, the earth will become uninhabitable no matter what we do. That's also misinformation, right? I mean, it's likely true in the very long run, but at least in the short to medium term, scientists still agree there are mitigation efforts we can do to cut down on the effects of climate change. If the misinformation is there's nothing we can do, that's going to lead to fatalism. This idea that, well, throw up our hands, there's nothing we can do, that's going to change the way we behave. We're not going to be advocating for different climate policies, and we might withdraw, right? Anxiety and fear are what we call withdrawal emotions, and so they're more likely to make us pull back and be less involved. It also changes, I think misinformation can change who we blame for changes in the climate, right? So it's not always, misinformation isn't always just about climate denial. It can also just be about general misinformation about what works, what doesn't work, as well as just lack of information about the climate. So we can look at, this is an AP NORC survey from 2022, who people blame for, or who has the responsibility for climate change. So this is what percent say that this group has a great deal or a lot of responsibility, right? 64% overall blame corporations and industry. And scientists agree that that's one of the largest contributors. So we might like to see that higher. There's a big partisan divide on that one, right? About 79% of Democrats versus 51% of Republicans. But still, overall, 64% say corporations and industry are to blame, when scientists say one of the largest contributors. But we also see things like 45% blame individual people, and 44% blame developing countries. And so we see perhaps a misplacement of blame, or an overemphasis on the role that perhaps individuals play. Um, and if we are assigning the blame to individuals, then we might believe that, well, individual actions are enough to combat climate change. When in fact, uh, the best science I have read says, even if every individual person fundamentally changed their daily behaviors in the most sort of climate favorable way, that's still not going to offset enough of the changes in the climate that come from the actions of corporations and industry and things like that. Again, what it also does is changes how the things we do, right? So there's some things that everyone says they do, right? 92% of people say, "Oh yeah, I turn off the lights when they're not needed." But there are a bunch of other things, right? Only about 8% say they've lived in a home with solar panels, reducing heating or air conditioning. 74% say they use energy efficient appliances. I'm skeptical of that one. I think that a lot of people want to or think that they use energy efficient appliances, but then when faced with the task of buying a new refrigerator or water heater, they buy the cheapest one, or the one that fits best, or that they like the color scheme, and not the one that actually has the best environmental rating. So it changes how we act. So even among believers, even among people who believe that the climate is changing, that it's caused by humans, the actions that we take are not always necessarily the most impactful. This comes from that article, Doing the Wrong Things for the Right Reasons. What do people do that they think are really, really valuable in helping the climate, but actually have not a ton of effect? Things like turning off lights, uh, unplugging your chargers and devices, turning off the water when you brush your teeth, taking shorter showers. Do those help? Sure. But people overestimate the value of those, and they drastically underestimate the value of some of the more influential pieces, right? Buying energy efficient appliances and light bulbs, replacing the insulation in your house to make sure you're not losing heat in the winter, buying or water efficient fixtures, flushing the toilet less frequently. There's a lot of social pressure around that one, and so it's not so much even among people who believe that climate change is happening. The actions that we think are helping are often the ones that have less influence, and the ones that we don't necessarily do as often and underestimate actually often have much more value. So there's a lot of danger in climate misinformation, not just in denying that it happens, but also in the misinformation about what we can do as individuals. What are the sort of the downstream effects then, right? Climate misinformation has a lot of longer term or sort of knock-on effects here. Big one that I think is a huge concern for people like myself, as well as scientists in general. Climate misinformation undermines trust in scientists. Um, that's a really big problem because that means not only that we're going to have less trust around the climate, but if you lose trust in scientists and experts, it also means you might be less likely to believe that vaccinations work, or you might be less likely to believe that certain cancer treatments are effective. And so it can have real public health consequences too. It also leads to greater political polarization. Right? This is a really interesting one, but the more this misinformation spreads, the more people get hardened into their partisan camps. And then we also see in a realm of lots of misinformation that companies have stepped in and they engage in something that we call greenwashing. So greenwashing is basically what we see when people don't necessarily know what is super beneficial to the environment. So companies try to step in to sort of inform people, but what they often do is do this in a way that's sort of deceptive to the public. It makes the public think that some product is better for the environment or for the climate than it actually is. And when that happens, that's what we call greenwashing. So we can see it. This is an ad that ran in New Zealand for Sprite, where they're touting the new clear bottle, right? And they're saying clear bottles are easier to recycle into other bottles than green plastic or darker plastic bottles. Is that true? Yes, it's not a lie. But the idea that a single-use plastic bottle is the best sort of option is ultimately like Coca-Cola is still one of the largest contributors of single-use plastics in the world. And so, yes, clear bottles are easier to recycle, but they're, putting a recycling sign on here. The ad campaign is all in green. It makes people think, oh, this is the environmentally smart choice. Well, or is not using single-use plastics the environmentally smart choice? Same thing we see with this is a great one. The eco-shape bottle with 15% less plastic. We can all make a difference. Well, okay. It's still a plastic water bottle. It's a single-use plastic water bottle. Nobody knows what an eco-shape is. Nobody's telling us less plastic than what. Um, Again, it's a bright green background. It gets people to think, oh, this is ecologically friendly. It's still a single-use plastic bottle, right? Is it better than filling a reusable water bottle from a safe water source? No, for the environment, that's clearly not better. But these are sort of what we think about with greenwashing. It's not just plastic bottles. We see it on laundry detergents. We see it in car company. We see it all over the place. These ideas that, small changes make this the right choice for the environment. And while it may be true that it has less plastic than other water bottles, it doesn't make it a good environmental choice. And then this is the part where I said that I would talk about how um, misinformation doesn't only spread among conservatives or Republicans. Even well-meaning efforts can often have disastrous effects. Um, and that we can imagine ways that this would happen in terms of climate misinformation. The one I want to talk about isn't climate misinformation, but it's about GMO crops. So scientists largely agree that genetically modified crops are safe to eat. About 88% of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, scientists of that group say yes, but only 37% of the general public believe that GMOs are safe to eat. And what that has done is led to real policy differences. The EU has made it very difficult to import GMOs. It's not impossible, but it's very difficult. Um, Consumers tend to not want to buy them. And as a result of this, many African countries which export to the US or I'm sorry, to the EU, partially because of the EU difficulty, have banned the planting of GMOs. And we might say, okay, well, that's fine. They'll just plant other crops. Except this has real consequences for human health and survival. So Wessler and colleagues in a PLOS One article from 2017 basically estimated what the number of lives that would be saved from if various types of GMO crops were planted. Anywhere from 400 to 4,000 lives in Kenya saved from planting GMO corn, 500 to 5,500 lives in Uganda if black sigatoka resistant matoke, which is a type of banana, were planted. And a 1 year delay in Nigeria of planting GMO cowpea could cost anywhere from 100 to 3,000 lives and $30, $40 million US in revenue. And it's not just lives saved. They calculate the reductions in the number of children who are stunted in their growth. And so with GMO corn, Sigatoka resistant matoke, or GMO cowpea, 1.8 million children, fewer children would be stunted in Kenya, 2.3 million children in Uganda, over 10 million children in Nigeria. So misinformation, in this case, GMO misinformation, but climate misinformation, we can imagine similar effects, could have real consequences for human health. Finally, let's think about dangers to Colorado, right? Climate change is already having large effects in Colorado. You can find reports from all over. CSU has a particularly good one. We're seeing global warming in Colorado, right? Especially in the Southwest and the South Central. Projections are anywhere from like 1.5 to 5 degrees Fahrenheit in a rise in temperature by 2070. We're seeing shifts in precipitation patterns, so more winter precipitation, less summer. We're also seeing, many of the state's largest wildfires are occurring in the last 25 years as a result of things like drought, land use policies, as well as pine and spruce beetle, which has killed a significant number of trees. They are able to survive the winters when winters are warmer. And so we're seeing climate change having these effects in Colorado. But the misinformation is not just about climate effects. And so we're seeing lots of these kind of components of climate misinformation. Just earlier this year, the Colorado Supreme Court allowed Boulder to continue their suit against Exxon and Suncor for air pollution, which some of the suit is based around misinformation. Boulder's mayor basically said corporations cannot mislead the public and avoid accountability. Right? In response to this decision, he basically said, no, we're not going to allow corporations to engage in the spread of misinformation. We're also still seeing politicians engage in misinformation spread around climate change. In the 2022 Republican Senate primary, State Rep Ron Hanks, Republican from Canyon City, said this, right? We've got to start marketing the truth. I don't want to sit here and pretend climate change is a real issue. It's called weather. That is a serious effort from China to emasculate us. So it's not just kind of a denial of climate change. It's also, again, kind of tapping into some of these kind of conspiracy theories around, well, it's something that China is doing to the US. So we saw it from Representative Hanks. Eli Bremer said, if you look at windmills, there's a lot of greenhouse gas emission costs that we gloss over. Virtually every expert that I've talked to believes that the overall return is negative. Well, no, that's just factually incorrect. Experts agree that while there are greenhouse gas emission costs to constructing windmills, the overall return is positive, not negative. And so, again, we're still seeing politicians, even in Colorado, engaging in this spread of misinformation. And it's not isolated to Republicans. So here we have Sunrise, Colorado, releasing, tweeting about this letter from Denver, and thanking the mayor and the Office of Sustainability for apologizing for allowing Suncor to sponsor the Sustainable Denver Summit, and then also thanking the city for declaring a climate emergency. Great. Nice tweet. Thank the mayor, thank the governor. The problem, of course, is that the city of Denver didn't do this. Sunrise, Colorado made up this letter. They did it to draw, it was a fake letter that they specifically did to draw attention to the issue. They wanted to draw attention to the fact that Suncor was sponsoring this and that the city wouldn't declare a climate emergency. But that's still the spread of misinformation, right? And that type of misinformation doesn't help those who want to make real change because it's just further undermining trust and confidence. So, what can we do? Last thing. Misinformation is absolutely a major problem. It's a problem internationally, nationally, in Colorado, in our local communities. And so we should be able to think or hope to consider what we can do. First off, I think it's important to understand why people believe misinformation and spread misinformation. We believe it because it matches our prior beliefs. That's the psychological part. We believe it because it looks like real information. And we believe it because we still want to do what is right. So we might believe misinformation that agrees with us because we think it's the right thing to do, even if we don't know that it's actually misinformation. So understanding why people believe it, not thinking it's just about ignorance, but it's also a psychological process, is I think really important. Once we understand that, I think we can start to call it out and correct it, regardless of who is saying it, right? That means if it's misinformation from the left or misinformation from the right, we should be correcting that misinformation. Now, the big thing I always want to say is make sure your correction is correct because we sometimes get even stronger backlash effects when corrections are proved wrong. So don't assume you know the right answer. So yes, we are in a drought in Colorado, but the reports from CSU suggest that we're actually going to see higher levels of winter precipitation, not lower, but lower summer precipitation. And so if somebody comes in and says climate change isn't happening, just look at all of the snow that we're getting. If you come in and say, actually, we have less snow than we did last year, and that's the evidence of climate change, and then they go out and they find this CSU report, right? And they say, well, actually, no, you're wrong. We have less snow this year, but we're going to get more snow overall. That can lead to backlash effects, right? So make sure you know you're confirming the correct information. So being informed is really important if you want to engage in these kind of corrections. Bigger picture, we have to help restore trust in scientists. We need to help people understand the scientific process, the fact that the process is iterative, and the fact that sometimes scientists get things wrong, but we have processes to correct that. And so helping them understand that. We also have to build more trust in our institutions of higher education. And we should encourage state and national funding for really rigorous scientific research. This is the way that we can both encourage scientists to keep doing important work and restore broader trust. And then I think holding people accountable, right? Holding corporations accountable based on what the science seems to suggest, politicians if they are spreading misinformation, and then this is a kind of maybe the wealthy. Schoengart just published an article. What their calculations show is that 2/3 of the warming, of the climate warming in the U.S. and China can be attributed to emissions that come from the top 10% of the wealthiest individuals. And I think 1/5 can be from the top 1%. So, and that makes sense to some extent, right? The wealthy are more able to travel, more able to buy cars, to do things like that, in a way that is more impactful on the climate. And then I think take meaningful action, right? Buying more efficient appliances, installing more efficient fixtures, changing out those light bulbs for LED lights. My wife always gets mad at me when I do that because she doesn't like the LED lights, and I always just buy new LED lights that are slightly different colors, and eventually I've found which ones she likes. So try out some different ones. And then the big one, and this is the last thing I'll talk about, is don't lose hope, right? Scientists still largely agree that we can make a difference. We may not be able to reverse all of the effects of the human-caused effects of climate change, but there are absolutely policies that can make a difference. Fear and hopelessness are withdrawal emotions. They lead us to inaction. Anger, being mad about the state of climate science, that's an approach emotion. Anger can lead us to involvement in action. So I hope that we don't lose hope. I hope that we can stay interested and involved, enthusiastic or angry, and get involved and continue to try to make a difference when it comes to climate change. And thank you. And I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Phil. It's it, this has been so helpful personally, is trying to decide what you're going to be doing, but also I think helps us in the broadest of categories. The league does two things: we educate and we advocate, and you've really given us some ways to think about how to make that more meaningful. And so thank you very much. Um, Dennis has a question. Dennis, if you want to unmute and ask your question.
Sorry. Yeah, you made the claim that, and I hadn't heard this before, that with warming, there's going to be a reduction in a summertime precipitation and wintertime increase. Where does that come from physically?
Yeah. So I'll start off by saying I can't answer that question because I'm not an environmental scientist. The information comes from Colorado State's report on the effects of climate change in Colorado. So I can give you the top line results from them. I'm not, my expertise is in political science. I encourage, if that's your expertise, I would encourage you to look at the Colorado State report. It has the whole, it's like, I don't know, 80, 90 pages long. They'll do a million times better than I could ever do trying to explain the basis for that. So I'm not even gonna try just because I don't want to speak outside my expertise.
Okay, thank you.
All right, I don't see anything else in the chat nor hands raised, so I will just say thank you on behalf of all of us. You've really given us a lot to absorb, and I would pass along that this recording will be posted on the Colorado League's website, as well as all the others that we have had and will be having. So it'll be there, Phil.
There is another. It
Question.
looks like there's a question in the chat as well.
Aha.
Um,
So
and
Laura,
I think Kathy has a hand raised.
Hi, Phil.
Hi.
I'm Josh's mom, by the way.
Hi. Yes.
Hi. I found it fascinating when you said that, let me put my video on so I know what I'm looking at. When you said that the more education somebody gets, if they are, let's see if I have this right, if they are, was it conservative or what was the term you used to clarify that? But the better they get at countering the
Mhm.
argument. And
Yeah.
that was fascinating to me because we keep hearing for years and years, well, we just have to educate people.
Mhm.
So what's the happy medium?
So, I think the happy medium is that at some point, right? And you're right. It's not just conservative. It happens on when there is, information that runs counter to liberal beliefs, right? Then the same counter arguing happens. Education is a way to it gives us tools. It gives us reading comprehension tools. It gives us argumentation tools, but we use those to support our prior beliefs. So the happy medium is I think we still engage in education around climate action because we have to, right? We there are still going to be people who aren't necessarily set in their beliefs and they can be moved. But we also need to be spending time uh, basically what conspiracy theory scholars call pre-bunking, but it's addressing what we're doing long before. So if it's better media literacy education in elementary and middle school and high school, right? Is it teaching, is it working to reduce political polarization? That's going to go a long ways. That's a big question. I teach that class. We never come to the correct answer because there isn't a correct answer for how to do that. But I think a lot of it is also teaching the skills so that, maybe it doesn't have, maybe we can't move everyone on climate change, but we can help some people and we can get the next generation the skills they need to address not just climate change, but the next problem that we don't even foresee. So better media literacy skills, better uh, techniques and tactics for recognizing when our bias is entering into our information search, our media search, and then trying to push back at those times.
Thanks.
Yeah, of course.
Laura, if you want to unmute and ask your question.
Sure. Dr. Chen, you mentioned that in order to counter misinformation, it's best to have correct information and make sure it's correct. So I wondered, what are the best sources of credible information about climate change and its effects?
Yeah, and so one of the big things I push a lot of my students on when they're, doing a variety of projects, especially in my conspiracy theories and misinformation class, is that a lot of times what they end up doing is saying like, okay, I want to write about uh, climate change misinformation, and so let me go to the Sierra Club and let me go to Greenpeace. Well, in some sense, no. I mean, what we don't want to do is look to um, organizations, even if they might have correct information, they're not likely to be viewed as credible sources. So it's really difficult uh, to convince somebody who already is distrustful of, say, the Sierra Club, that the thing the Sierra Club is putting out is accurate. And so where I always encourage them to go is and there are problems with this, but government organizations, peer-reviewed science, and local universities. Now, there are going to be issues, right? Because we're seeing that it's trust in government is a big predictor of support for climate science, and so the what NASA puts out, NASA's a great, actually NASA has some great um, uh, information out there. And NASA is still relatively trusted among the public. And so it's maybe not as politicized as, maybe like NOAA or like even a university. So NASA is a good place. They have some really interesting information. It's kind of top, like big, sort of uh, bigger scale information. And then, yeah, local universities, especially, well-respected state universities. If somebody denies climate change but they went to CSU and now they see this CSU report, well, maybe that helps. Maybe having gone to the university makes them a more trusted source. And so, you might get directed to these things from something like the Sierra Club or Greenpeace or, an advocacy organization, and that's okay. But I always encourage people to trace it back to the source because that's going to be, and that source, and if you can't trace it back, if it's, here's this poll that we have that shows that, 89% of people believe that the government should do more for climate change. Well, if you can't trace it back to Pew or Gallup or NORC or the AP or a bigger survey firm, and it turns out it's just, oh, well, this was our survey of members. Okay, well, that's not good science. That's not good research. And so the more you can to trace it back to a university or a government agency or a well-respected polling agency, the better.
Thank you.
Good. Sandy, unmute.
Speaking of going back to the source of the GMO report, who was
Yes.
that?
That is Plessler et al. Wessler et al. And it's in PLOS One from 2017. I believe it is public. I believe it is not behind a paywall. So you should be able to get it. But if you can't, somebody has my email and I can send you a PDF of it.
Okay. I'm skeptical of GMOs, and that's why I'm asking that question.
Yeah.
And
So the Wessler is about the effects of GMO crops in Africa. There's a lot of different sources. Uh, on like scientific consensus around GMOs. And so I have I off the top of my head I don't have them, but I have them in my like materials from teaching class. And so again, if you're looking for that, I'm happy uh to send along some of the sources.
we all have our conspiracy theories, right?
Well, and the truth is like this is one of those where, it's not necessarily a conspiracy theory. It's just, I mean, and one of the things that students often bring up when I talk about that is they say, well, okay, they're probably safe to eat, but Monsanto is just making a bunch of money off of them. And those two things are actually not mutually exclusive. They can be both safe to eat and real money makers for corporations. And so like the contours of around GMOs are really, it's a really interesting area of study.
Thank you.
Anyone else?
I think Joe is raising his hand.
Yeah. Unmute. Unmute.
That's Maggie. You're not unmuting, Maggie.
No,
She's
I
having
think
trouble.
you'll have to, yeah, that's because, can you do it, Beth? Are you the one?
I can't.
Okay. Send signals.
You
there,
do it now.
Joe, I
There
think
you
you're
go.
unmuted.
Okay. I just was wondering when using sources of journals that are peer reviewed are useful, such as Nature or New England Journal of Medicine, or
Mhm.
lots of them out there.
Are those what I'm talking about?
Well, as sources,
Yeah.
are they useful to use?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. And I think actually Nature is a really interesting example. So they published a few years ago an article by a group of scientists who basically said by the end of the century, we will see a 60% decrease in economic activity because of climate change effects. And that was so wildly out of line. The general consensus is about 20% reduction in economic activity. And this was this really big groundbreaking, and they just retracted that article. It turns out that the data showed that they had failed to account for connections between countries. And so that specifically the data around Uzbekistan was kind of an outlier and was driving up their estimates. And when you corrected for that, based on some responses from people who had read the article, they said, actually, you should probably correct for that. And they did, and it brought it back down into that sort of 20-ish percent level. That's normal academic science, right? That's a good way that we that's a really normal way that we as scientists conduct our research. It maybe should have been caught in peer review, but it wasn't, right? And then when it was caught, Nature retracted. And it doesn't change the fact that 20% reduction in worldwide economic activity is a really huge percentage of economic activity being reduced. It just happens to not be 60%. And so nature is really great because they also engage in this kind of retraction and correction process, just like almost every good reputable journal does.
Well, thank you so much, Phil.
Of course.
Yes.
This has been a great combination of just what we were hoping for, of showing us how to get good information, scientific information about climate change. And so thank you. Is there a way that we should contact you if you were wanting some of the, if we were wanting some of the bibliography or something like that?
Sure. I just put my email, philip.chen@du.edu, into the chat. So you're always welcome to email me. I'm happy to send along things as I get them. So.
Good. And the recording will be posted on the Colorado League's website, and I think probably others. So we can redo this. It's going to take a lot of absorbing several times. Thank you.
Well, and I'm always happy to answer more questions as things come up.
They'll be there.
Thank you.
Let me give a little information about what's coming up. Our next speaker in this
I'm going to run to get my daughter from school. So
thank her for sharing you with us.
Will do.
Yeah. Our next speaker in this continuing series on the effects of climate change and misinformation will be Dr. Kate Gilbert. She's a research scientist in immunology, immunotoxicology, and human health toxicology. League member Kate Gilbert says, quote, learning about Colorado-specific pollution has been both fascinating and disheartening, and I hope our discussion of it can be useful for all of us. Her presentation will be titled Forever Chemicals in Colorado and Why They May Live Up to Their Name. She'll be Zoomed on Wednesday, January 21st at 7 o'clock. These 2 task force series will be following the 3 task force series presentation on the same night. So they end at 7 and we'll pick up and start at 7. And on behalf of all of us, the Climate Emergency and the News Access and Literacy Task Force, we appreciate your participating in tonight's presentation that affects us all. So thank you, good night, and happy holidays.
Good night.
Good night.